Chapter 15 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Part 2. Paradise Regained. Chapter 15. The Story of the Trial. The Preliminaries. Let me confess another weakness on my part, before I begin the story of the Trial. I cannot prevail upon myself to copy, for the second time, the horrible title page which holds up to public ignominy my husband's name. I have copied it once in my 10th chapter. Let once be enough. Turning to the second page of the Trial, I found a note, assuring the reader of the absolute correctness of the report of the proceedings. The compiler described himself as having enjoyed certain special privileges. Thus, the presiding judge had himself revised his charge to the jury. And again, the chief lawyers of the prosecution and the defense, following the judge's example, had revised their speeches for and against the prisoner. Lastly, particular care had been taken to secure a literally correct report of the evidence given by the various witnesses. It was some relief to me to discover this note, and to be satisfied at the outset that the story of the Trial was, in every particular, fully and truly given. The next page interested me more nearly still. It enumerated the actors in the judicial drama, the men who held in their hands my husband's honor and my husband's life. Here is the list: the Lord Justice Clerk, Lord Drumfennig, Lord Noblecirk, Judges on the bench. The Lord Advocate, Mintlaw, Donald Drew, Esquire. Advocate Depute, Counsel for the Crown. Mr. James Airless, W.S., Agent for the Crown. The Dean of Faculty, Farmichael, Counsel for the Panel. Alexander Crockett, Esquire, Advocate, otherwise the prisoner. Mr. Thornybank, W.S. Mr. Playmore, W.S., agents for the panel. The indictment against the prisoner then followed. I shall not copy the uncouth language, full of needless repetitions, and, if I know anything of the subject, not guiltless of bad grammar as well, in which my innocent husband was solemnly and falsely accused of poisoning his first wife. The less there is of that false and hateful indictment on this page, the better and truer the page will look, to my eyes. To be brief, then, Eustace Macallan was indicted and accused, at the instance of David Mintlaw, Esquire, Her Majesty's Advocate, for Her Majesty's interest, of the murder of his wife by poison at his residence called Gleninch, in the county of Mid Lothian. The poison was alleged to have been wickedly and feloniously given by the prisoner to his wife Sarah on 2 occasions, in the form of arsenic, administered in tea, medicine, or other article or articles of food or drink, to the prosecutor unknown. It was further declared that the prisoner's wife had died of the poison thus administered by her husband, on one or other or both of the stated occasions, and that she was thus murdered by her husband. The next paragraph asserted that the said Eustace Macallan, taken before John Daviot, Esquire, Advocate, Sheriff Substitute of Mid Lothian, did in his presence at Edinburgh, on a given date, the 29th of October, subscribe a declaration stating his innocence of the alleged crime, this declaration being reserved in the indictment, together with certain documents, papers, and articles, enumerated in an inventory, to be used in evidence against the prisoner. The indictment concluded by declaring that, in the event of the offense charged against the prisoner being found proven by the verdict, he, the said Eustace Macallan, ought to be punished with the pains of the law, to deter others from committing like crimes in all time coming. So much for the indictment. I have done with it, and I am rejoiced to be done with it. An inventory of papers, documents, and articles followed at great length on the next 3 pages. This, in its turn, was succeeded by the list of the witnesses, and by the names of the jurors, 15 in number, balloted for to try the case. And then, at last, the report of the Trial began. It resolved itself, to my mind, into 3 great questions. As it appeared to me at the time, so let me present it here. End of chapter 15. 16 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 16. First question. Did the woman die poisoned? The proceedings began at 10 o'clock. The prisoner was placed at the bar before the High Court of Justiciary at Edinburgh. He bowed respectfully to the bench, and pleaded "Not guilty" in a low voice. It was observed by every one present that the prisoner's face betrayed traces of acute mental suffering. He was deadly pale. His eyes never once wandered to the crowd in the court. When certain witnesses appeared against him, he looked at them with a momentary attention. At other times he kept his eyes on the ground. When the evidence touched on his wife's illness and death, he was deeply affected, and covered his face with his hands. It was a subject of general remark and general surprise that the prisoner, in this case, although a man, showed far less self possession than the last prisoner tried in that court for murder, a woman who had been convicted on overwhelming evidence. There were persons present, a small minority only, who considered this want of composure on the part of the prisoner to be a sign in his favor. Self-possession, in his dreadful position, signified to their minds the stark insensibility of a heartless and shameless criminal, and afforded in itself a presumption not of innocence but of guilt. The first witness called was John Daviot, Esquire, Sheriff Substitute of Midlothian. He was examined by the Lord Advocate as counsel for the prosecution, and said: "The prisoner was brought before me on the present charge. He made and subscribed a declaration on the 29th of October. It was freely and voluntarily made, the prisoner having been first duly warned and admonished." Having identified the declaration, the Sheriff Substitute, being cross-examined by the Dean of Faculty, as counsel for the defense, continued his evidence in these words: "The charge against the prisoner was murder. This was communicated to him before he made the declaration. The questions addressed to the prisoner were put partly by me, partly by another officer, the Procurator Fiscal. The answers were given distinctly, and, so far as I could judge, without reserve. The statements put forward in the declaration were all made in answer to questions asked by the Procurator Fiscal or by myself." A clerk in the Sheriff Clerk's office then officially produced the declaration, and corroborated the evidence of the witness who had preceded him. The appearance of the next witness created a marked sensation in the court. This was no less a person than the nurse who had attended Mrs. Macallan in her last illness, by name Christina Ormsay. After the first formal answers, the nurse, examined by the Lord Advocate, proceeded to say: "I was first sent for to attend the deceased lady on the 7th of October. She was then suffering from a severe cold, accompanied by a rheumatic affection of the left knee joint. Previous to this, I understood that her health had been fairly good. She was not a very difficult person to nurse when you got used to her and understood how to manage her. The main difficulty was caused by her temper. She was not a sullen person; she was headstrong and violent, easily excited to fly into a passion, and quite reckless in her fits of anger as to what she said or did. At such times, I really hardly think she knew what she was about. My own idea is that her temper was made still more irritable by unhappiness in her married life. She was far from being a reserved person. Indeed, she was disposed, as I thought, to be a little too communicative about herself and her troubles with persons like me who were beneath her in station. She did not scruple, for instance, to tell me, when we had been long enough together to get used to each other, that she was very unhappy, and fretted a good deal about her husband. One night, when she was wakeful and restless, she said to me—" The Dean of Faculty here interposed, speaking on the prisoner's behalf. He appealed to the judges to say whether such loose and unreliable evidence as this was evidence which could be received by the court. The Lord Advocate, speaking on behalf of the Crown, claimed it as his right to produce the evidence. It was of the utmost importance in this case to show, on the testimony of an unprejudiced witness, on what terms the husband and wife were living. The witness was a most respectable woman. She had won, and deserved, the confidence of the unhappy lady whom she attended on her deathbed. After briefly consulting together, the judges unanimously decided that the evidence could not be admitted. What the witness had herself seen and observed of the relations between the husband and wife was the only evidence that they could receive. The Lord Advocate thereupon continued his examination of the witness. Christina Ormsay resumed her evidence as follows. My position as nurse led necessarily to my seeing more of Mrs. Macallan than any other person in the house. I am able to speak from experience of many things not known to others who were only in her room at intervals. For instance, I had more than one opportunity of personally observing that Mr. and Mrs. Macallan did not live together very happily. I can give you an example of this, not drawn from what others told me, but from what I noticed for myself. Toward the latter part of my attendance on Mrs. Macallan, a young widowed lady named Mrs. Beauly, a cousin of Mr. Macallan's, came to stay at Gleninch. Mrs. Macallan was jealous of this lady, and she showed it in my presence only the day before her death, when Mr. Macallan came into her room to inquire how she had passed the night. "Oh," she said, "never mind how I have slept! What do you care whether I sleep well or ill? How has Mrs. Beauly passed the night? Is she more beautiful than ever this morning? Go back to her, pray go back to her! Don't waste your time with me." Beginning in that manner, she worked herself into one of her furious rages. I was brushing her hair at the time, and feeling that my presence was an impropriety under the circumstances, I attempted to leave the room. She forbade me to go. Mr. Macallan felt, as I did, that my duty was to withdraw, and he said so in plain words. Mrs. Macallan insisted on my staying in language so insolent to her husband that he said, "If you cannot control yourself, either the nurse leaves the room or I do." She refused to yield even then. "A good excuse," she said, "for getting back to Mrs. Beauly. Go!" He took her at her word, and walked out of the room. He had barely closed the door before she began reviling him to me in the most shocking manner. She declared, among other things she said of him, that the news of all others which he would be most glad to hear would be the news of her death. I ventured, quite respectfully, on remonstrating with her. She took up the hair brush and threw it at me, and then and there dismissed me from my attendance on her. I left her, and waited below until her fit of passion had worn itself out. Then I returned to my place at the bedside, and for a while things went on again as usual. It may not be amiss to add a word which may help to explain Mrs. Macallan's jealousy of her husband's cousin. Mrs. Macallan was a very plain woman. She had a cast in one of her eyes, and, if I may use the expression, one of the most muddy, blotchy complexions it was ever my misfortune to see in a person's face. Mrs. Beauly, on the other hand, was a most attractive lady. Her eyes were universally admired, and she had a most beautifully clear and delicate colour. Poor Mrs. Macallan said of her, most untruly, that she painted. No, the defects in the complexion of the deceased lady were not in any way attributable to her illness. I should call them born and bred defects in herself. Her illness, if I am asked to describe it, I should say was troublesome, nothing more. Until the last day there were no symptoms in the least degree serious about the malady that had taken her. Her rheumatic knee was painful, of course, acutely painful, if you like, when she moved it, and the confinement to bed was irksome enough, no doubt. But otherwise there was nothing in the lady's condition, before the fatal attack came, to alarm her or anybody about her. She had her books and her writing materials on an invalid table, which worked on a pivot, and could be arranged in any position most agreeable to her. At times she read and wrote a good deal. At other times she lay quiet, thinking her own thoughts, or talking with me, and with one or two lady friends in the neighbourhood who came regularly to see her. Her writing, so far as I knew, was almost entirely of the poetical sort. She was a grand hand at composing poetry. On one occasion only she showed me some of her poems. I am no judge of such things. Her poetry was of the dismal kind, despairing about herself, and wondering why she had ever been born, and nonsense like that. Her husband came in more than once for some hard hits at his cruel heart and his ignorance of his wife's merit. In short, she vented her discontent with her pen as well as with her tongue. There were times, and pretty often too, when an angel from heaven would have failed to have satisfied Mrs. Macallan. Throughout the period of her illness, the deceased lady occupied the same room, a large bedroom situated, like all the best bedrooms, on the first floor of the house. Yes, the plan of the room now shown to me is quite accurately taken, according to my remembrance of it. One door led into the great passage or corridor, on which all the doors opened. A second door, at one side, marked B on the plan, led to Mr. Macallan's sleeping room. A third door, on the opposite side, marked C on the plan, communicated with a little study or book room, used, as I was told, by Mr. Macallan's mother when she was staying at Gleninch, but seldom or never entered by any one else. Mr. Macallan's mother was not at Gleninch while I was there. The door between the bedroom and this study was locked, and the key was taken out. I don't know who had the key, or whether there were more keys than one in existence. The door was never opened to my knowledge. I only got into the study to look at it along with the housekeeper by entering through a second door that opened on to the corridor. I beg to say that I can speak from my own knowledge positively about Mrs. Macallan's illness, and about the sudden change which ended in her death. By the doctor's advice, I made notes at the time of dates and hours and such like. I looked at my notes before coming here. From the 7th of October, when I was first called in to nurse her, to the 20th of the same month, she slowly but steadily improved in health. Her knee was still painful, no doubt, but the inflammatory look of it was disappearing. As to the other symptoms, except weakness from lying in bed and irritability of temper, there was really nothing the matter with her. She slept badly, I ought perhaps to add, but we remedied this by means of composing draughts prescribed for that purpose by the doctor. On the morning of the 21st, at a few minutes past 6, I got my first alarm that something was going wrong with Mrs. Macallan. I was awoke, at the time I have mentioned, by the ringing of the hand-bell which she kept on her bed-table. Let me say for myself that I had only fallen asleep on the sofa in the bedroom at past 2 in the morning from sheer fatigue. Mrs. Macallan was then awake. She was in one of her bad humours with me. I had tried to prevail on her to let me remove her dressing-case from her bed-table, after she had used it in making her toilet for the night. It took up a great deal of room, and she could not possibly want it again before the morning. But no, she insisted on my letting it be. There was a glass inside the case, and, plain as she was, she never wearied of looking at herself in that glass. I saw that she was in a bad state of temper, so I gave her her way, and let the dressing-case be. Finding that she was too sullen to speak to me after that, and too obstinate to take her composing draught from me when I offered it, I laid me down on the sofa at her bed foot, and fell asleep, as I have said. The moment her bell rang, I was up and at the bedside, ready to make myself useful. I asked what was the matter with her. She complained of faintness and depression, and said she felt sick. I inquired if she had taken anything in the way of physic or food while I had been asleep. She answered that her husband had come in about an hour since, and, finding her still sleepless, had himself administered the composing draught. Mr. Macallan, sleeping in the next room, joined us while she was speaking. He too had been aroused by the bell. He heard what Mrs. Macallan said to me about the composing draught, and made no remark upon it. It seemed to me that he was alarmed at his wife's faintness. I suggested that she should take a little wine, or brandy and water. She answered that she could swallow nothing so strong as wine or brandy, having a burning pain in her stomach already. I put my hand on her stomach, quite lightly. She screamed when I touched her. This symptom alarmed us. We went to the village for the medical man who had attended Mrs. Macallan during her illness, one Mr. Gale. The doctor seemed no better able to account for the change for the worse in his patient than we were. Hearing her complain of thirst, he gave her some milk. Not long after taking it she was sick. The sickness appeared to relieve her. She soon grew drowsy and slumbered. Mr. Gale left us, with strict injunctions to send for him instantly if she was taken ill again. Nothing of the sort happened. No change took place for the next 3 hours or more. She roused up toward 9:30, and inquired about her husband. I informed her that he had returned to his own room, and asked if I should send for him. She said, No. I asked next if she would like anything to eat or drink. She said No again, in rather a vacant, stupefied way, and then told me to go downstairs and get my breakfast. On my way down I met the housekeeper. She invited me to breakfast with her in her room, instead of in the servants' hall as usual. I remained with the housekeeper but a short time, certainly not more than half an hour. Coming upstairs again, I met the under housemaid sweeping on one of the landings. The girl informed me that Mrs. Macallan had taken a cup of tea during my absence in the housekeeper's room. Mr. Macallan's valet had ordered the tea for his mistress by his master's direction. The under housemaid made it, and took it upstairs herself to Mrs. Macallan's room. Her master, she said, opened the door when she knocked, and took the teacup from her with his own hand. He opened the door widely enough for her to see into the bedroom, and to notice that nobody was with Mrs. Macallan but himself. After a little talk with the under housemaid, I returned to the bedroom. No one was there. Mrs. Macallan was lying perfectly quiet, with her face turned away from me on the pillow. Approaching the bedside, I kicked against something on the floor. It was a broken teacup. I said to Mrs. Macallan, "How comes the teacup to be broken, ma'am?" She answered without turning towards me, in an odd muffled kind of voice, "I dropped it." "Before you drank your tea, ma'am?" I asked. "No," she said, "in handing the cup back to Mr. Macallan, after I had done." I had put my question, wishing to know, in case she had spilled the tea when she dropped the cup, whether it would be necessary to get her any more. I am quite sure I remember correctly my question and her answer. I inquired next if she had been long alone. She said shortly, "Yes, I have been trying to sleep." I said, "Do you feel pretty comfortable?" She answered, "Yes," again. All this time she still kept her face sulkily turned from me toward the wall. Stooping over her to arrange the bedclothes, I looked toward her table. The writing materials which were always kept on it were disturbed, and there was wet ink on one of the pens. I said, "Surely you haven't been writing, ma'am?" "Why not?" she said. "I couldn't sleep." "Another poem?" I asked. She laughed to herself, a bitter short laugh. "Yes," she said, "another poem." "That's good," I said. "It looks as if you were getting quite like yourself again. We shan't want the doctor any more to day." She made no answer to this, except an impatient sign with her hand. I didn't understand the sign. Upon that she spoke again, and crossly enough too. "I want to be alone. Leave me." I had no choice but to do as I was told. To the best of my observation, there was nothing the matter with her, and nothing for the nurse to do. I put the bell rope within reach of her hand, and went downstairs again. Half an hour more, as well as I can guess it, passed. I kept within hearing of the bell, but it never rang. I was not quite at my ease, without exactly knowing why. That odd muffled voice in which she had spoken to me hung on my mind, as it were. I was not quite satisfied about leaving her alone for too long a time together; and then, again, I was unwilling to risk throwing her into one of her fits of passion by going back before she rang for me. It ended in my venturing into the room on the ground floor called the morning room, to consult Mr. Macallan. He was usually to be found there in the forenoon of the day. On this occasion, however, when I looked into the morning room, it was empty. At the same moment I heard the master's voice on the terrace outside. I went out, and found him speaking to one Mr. Dexter, an old friend of his, and, like Mrs. Beauly, a guest staying in the house. Mr. Dexter was sitting at the window of his room upstairs. He was a cripple, and could only move himself about in a chair on wheels; and Mr. Macallan was speaking to him from the terrace below. "Dexter," I heard Mr. Macallan say, "where is Mrs. Beauly? Have you seen anything of her?" Mr. Dexter answered, in his quick, off-handed way of speaking, "Not I. I know nothing about her." Then I advanced, and, begging pardon for intruding, I mentioned to Mr. Macallan the difficulty I was in about going back or not to his wife's room without waiting until she rang for me. Before he could advise me in the matter, the footman made his appearance, and informed me that Mrs. Macallan's bell was then ringing, and ringing violently. It was then close on 11 o'clock. As fast as I could mount the stairs, I hastened back to the bedroom. Before I opened the door, I heard Mrs. Macallan groaning. She was in dreadful pain, feeling a burning heat in the stomach and in the throat, together with the same sickness which had troubled her in the early morning. Though no doctor, I could see in her face that this second attack was of a far more serious nature than the first. After ringing the bell for a messenger to send to Mr. Macallan, I ran to the door to see if any of the servants happened to be within call. The only person I saw in the corridor was Mrs. Beauly. She was on her way from her own room, she said, to inquire after Mrs. Macallan's health. I said to her, "Mrs. Macallan is seriously ill again, ma'am. Would you please tell Mr. Macallan and send for the doctor?" She ran downstairs at once to do as I told her. I had not been long back at the bedside when Mr. Macallan and Mrs. Beauly both came in together. Mrs. Macallan cast a strange look on them, a look I cannot at all describe, and bade them leave her. Mrs. Beauly, looking very much frightened, withdrew immediately. Mr. Macallan advanced a step or two nearer to the bed. His wife looked at him again in the same strange way, and cried out, half as if she was threatening him, half as if she was entreating him, "Leave me with the nurse! Go!" He only waited to say to me in a whisper, "The doctor is sent for," and then he left the room. Before Mr. Gale arrived, Mrs. Macallan was violently sick. What came from her was muddy and frothy, and faintly streaked with blood. When Mr. Gale saw it, he looked very serious. I heard him say to himself, "What does this mean?" He did his best to relieve Mrs. Macallan, but with no good result that I could see. After a time she seemed to suffer less. Then more sickness came on. Then there was another intermission. Whether she was suffering or not, I observed that her hands and feet, whenever I touched them, remained equally cold. Also, the doctor's report of her pulse was always the same, very small and feeble. I said to Mr. Gale, "What is to be done, sir?" And Mr. Gale said to me, "I won't take the responsibility on myself any longer. I must have a physician from Edinburgh." The fastest horse in the stables at Gleninch was put into a dog cart, and the coachman drove away full speed to Edinburgh to fetch the famous Dr. Jerome. While we were waiting for the physician, Mr. Macallan came into his wife's room with Mr. Gale. Exhausted as she was, she instantly lifted her hand and signed to him to leave her. He tried by soothing words to persuade her to let him stay. No, she still insisted on sending him out of her room. He seemed to feel it at such a time and in the presence of the doctor. Before she was aware of him, he suddenly stepped up to the bedside and kissed her on the forehead. She shrank from him with a scream. Mr. Gale interfered, and led him out of the room. In the afternoon Dr. Jerome arrived. The great physician came just in time to see her seized with another attack of sickness. He watched her attentively, without speaking a word. In the interval when the sickness stopped, he still studied her, as it were, in perfect silence. I thought he would never have done examining her. When he was at last satisfied, he told me to leave him alone with Mr. Gale. "We will ring," he said, "when we want you here again." It was a long time before they rang for me. The coachman was sent for before I was summoned back to the bedroom. He was dispatched to Edinburgh for the second time, with a written message from Dr. Jerome to his head servant, saying that there was no chance of his returning to the city and to his patients for some hours to come. Some of us thought this looked badly for Mrs. Macallan. Others said it might mean that the doctor had hopes of saving her, but expected to be a long time in doing it. At last I was sent for. On my presenting myself in the bedroom, Dr. Jerome went out to speak to Mr. Macallan, leaving Mr. Gale along with me. From that time, as long as the poor lady lived, I was never left alone with her. One of the two doctors was always in her room. Refreshments were prepared for them, but still they took it in turns to eat their meal, one relieving the other at the bedside. If they had administered remedies to their patient, I should not have been surprised by this proceeding. But they were at the end of their remedies. Their only business then seemed to be to keep watch. I was puzzled to account for this. Keeping watch was the nurse's business. I thought the conduct of the doctors very strange. By the time that the lamp was lighted in the sick room, I could see that the end was near. Excepting an occasional feeling of cramp in her legs, she seemed to suffer less. But her eyes looked sunk in her head, her skin was cold and clammy, her lips had turned to a bluish paleness. Nothing roused her now, excepting the last attempt made by her husband to see her. He came in with Dr. Jerome, looking like a man terror-struck. She was past speaking, but the moment she saw him she feebly made signs and sounds which showed that she was just as resolved as ever not to let him come near her. He was so overwhelmed that Mr. Gale was obliged to help him out of the room. No other person was allowed to see the patient. Mr. Dexter and Mrs. Beauly made their inquiries outside the door, and were not invited in. As the evening drew on, the doctor sat on either side of the bed, silently watching her, silently waiting for her death. Toward 8 o'clock she seemed to have lost the use of her hands and arms. They lay helpless outside the bedclothes. A little later she sank into a sort of dull sleep. Little by little the sound of her heavy breathing grew fainter. At 20 minutes past 9 Dr. Jerome told me to bring the lamp to the bedside. He looked at her and put his hand on her heart. Then he said to me, "You can go downstairs, nurse. It is all over." He turned to Mr. Gale. "Will you inquire if Mr. Macallan can see us?" he said. I opened the door for Mr. Gale, and followed him out. Dr. Jerome called me back for a moment, and told me to give him the key of the door. I did so, of course; but I thought it also very strange. When I got down to the servants' hall, I found there was a general feeling that something was wrong. We were all uneasy, without knowing why. A little later the two doctors left the house. Mr. Macallan had been quite incapable of receiving them and hearing what they had to say. In this difficulty they had spoken privately, with Mr. Dexter as Mr. Macallan's old friend, and the only gentleman then staying at Gleninch. Before bedtime, I went upstairs to prepare the remains of the deceased lady for the coffin. The room in which she lay was locked, the door leading into Mr. Macallan's room being secured, as well as the door leading into the corridor. The keys had been taken away by Mr. Gale. Two of the men servants were posted outside the bedroom to keep watch. They were to be relieved at 4 in the morning. That was all they could tell me. In the absence of any explanations or directions, I took the liberty of knocking at the door of Mr. Dexter's room. From his lips I first heard the startling news. Both the doctors had refused to give the usual certificate of death. There was to be a medical examination of the body in the morning. There the examination of the nurse, Christina Ormsay, came to an end. Ignorant as I was of the law, I could see what impression the evidence so far was intended to produce on the minds of the jury. After first showing that my husband had had two opportunities of administering the poison, once in the medicine and once in the tea, the counsel for the Crown led the jury to infer that the prisoner had taken those opportunities to rid himself of an ugly and jealous wife, whose detestable temper he could no longer endure. Having directed his examination to the attainment of this object, the Lord Advocate had done with the witness. The Dean of Faculty, acting in the prisoner's interest, then rose to bring out the favourable side of the wife's character by cross-examining the nurse. If he succeeded in this attempt, the jury might reconsider their conclusion that the wife was a person who had exasperated her husband beyond endurance. In that case, where, so far, was the husband's motive for poisoning her, and where was the presumption of the prisoner's guilt? Pressed by the skillful lawyer, the nurse was obliged to exhibit my husband's first wife under an entirely new aspect. Here is the substance of what the Dean of Faculty extracted from Christina Ormsay. I persist in declaring that Mrs. Macallan had a most violent temper, but she was certainly in the habit of making amends for the offense that she gave by her violence. When she was quiet again, she always made her excuses to me, and she made them with a good grace. Her manners were engaging at such times as these. She spoke and acted like a well-bred lady. Then again, as to her personal appearance. Plain as she was in face, she had a good figure. Her hands and feet, I was told, had been modelled by a sculptor. She had a very pleasant voice, and she was reported when in health to sing beautifully. She was also, if her maid's account was to be trusted, a pattern in the matter of dressing for the other ladies in the neighbourhood. Then, as to Mrs. Beauly, though she was certainly jealous of the beautiful young widow, she had shown at the same time that she was capable of controlling that feeling. It was through Mrs. Macallan that Mrs. Beauly was in the house. Mrs. Beauly had wished to postpone her visit on account of the state of Mrs. Macallan's health. It was Mrs. Macallan herself, not her husband, who decided that Mrs. Beauly should not be disappointed, and should pay her visit to Gleninch then and there. Further, Mrs. Macallan, in spite of her temper, was popular with her friends and popular with her servants. There was hardly a dry eye in the house when it was known she was dying. And, further still, in those little domestic disagreements at which the nurse had been present, Mr. Macallan had never lost his temper, and had never used harsh language. He seemed to be more sorry than angry when the quarrels took place. Morale for the jury. Was this the sort of woman who would exasperate a man into poisoning her? And was this the sort of man who would be capable of poisoning his wife? Having produced this salutary counter-impression, the Dean of Faculty sat down, and the medical witnesses were called next. Here the evidence was simply irresistible. Dr. Jerome and Mr. Gale positively swore that the symptoms of the illness were the symptoms of poisoning by arsenic. The surgeon who had performed the post-mortem examination followed. He positively swore that the appearance of the internal organs proved Dr. Jerome and Mr. Gale to be right in declaring that their patient had died poisoned. Lastly, to complete this overwhelming testimony, two analytical chemists actually produced in court the arsenic which they had found in the body, in a quantity admittedly sufficient to have killed two persons instead of one. In the face of such evidence as this, cross-examination was a mere form. The first question raised by the trial, "Did the woman die poisoned?" was answered in the affirmative, and answered beyond the possibility of doubt. The next witnesses called were witnesses concerned with the question that now followed, the obscure and terrible question, "Who poisoned her?" Chapter 16. Of the Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 17. Second question. Who poisoned her? The evidence of the doctors and the chemists closed the proceedings on the first day of the trial. On the second day, the evidence to be produced by the prosecution was anticipated with a general feeling of curiosity and interest. The court was now to hear what had been seen and done by the persons officially appointed to verify such cases of suspected crime as the case which had occurred at Gleninch. The Procurator Fiscal, being the person officially appointed to direct the preliminary investigations of the law, was the first witness called on the second day of the trial. Examined by the Lord Advocate, the Fiscal gave his evidence as follows. On the 26th of October I received a communication from Dr. Jerome, of Edinburgh, and from Mr. Alexander Gale, medical practitioner, residing in the village or hamlet of Dingdovie, near Edinburgh. The communication related to the death, under circumstances of suspicion, of Mrs. Eustace Macallan, at her husband's house, hard by Dingdovie, called Gleninch. There were also forwarded to me, enclosed in the document just mentioned, two reports. One described the results of a post mortem examination of the deceased lady, and the other stated the discoveries made after a chemical analysis of certain of the interior organs of her body. The result in both instances proved to demonstration that Mrs. Eustace Macallan had died of poisoning by arsenic. Under these circumstances, I set in motion a search and inquiry in the house at Gleninch and elsewhere, simply for the purpose of throwing light on the circumstances which had attended the lady's death. No criminal charge in connection with the death was made at my office against any person, either in the communication which I received from the medical men or in any other form. The investigations at Gleninch and elsewhere, beginning on the 26th of October, were not completed until the 28th. Upon this latter date, acting on certain discoveries which were reported to me, and on my own examination of letters and other documents brought to my office, I made a criminal charge against the prisoner, and obtained a warrant for his apprehension. He was examined before the Sheriff on the 29th of October, and was committed for trial before this court. The Fiscal having made his statement, and having been cross examined on technical matters only, the persons employed in his office were called next. These men had a story of startling interest to tell. Theirs were the fatal discoveries which had justified the Fiscal in charging my husband with the murder of his wife. The first of the witnesses was a sheriff's officer. He gave his name as Isaiah Schoolcraft. Examined by Mr. Drew, Advocate Depute, and Counsel for the Crown, with the Lord Advocate, Isaiah Schoolcraft said: I got a warrant on the 26th of October to go to the country house near Edinburgh called Gleninch. I took with me Robert Lorry, assistant to the Fiscal. We first examined the room in which Mrs. Eustace Macallan had died. On the bed, and on a movable table which was attached to it, we found books and writing materials, and a paper containing some unfinished verses in manuscript, afterwards identified as being in the handwriting of the deceased. We enclosed these articles in paper, and sealed them up. We next opened an Indian cabinet in the bedroom. Here we found many more verses, on many more sheets of paper, in the same handwriting. We also discovered, first some letters, and next a crumpled piece of paper thrown aside in a corner of one of the shelves. On closer examination, a chemist's printed label was discovered on this morsel of paper. We also found, in the folds of it, a few scattered grains of some white powder. The paper and the letters were carefully enclosed and sealed up as before. Further investigation of the room revealed nothing which could throw any light on the purpose of our inquiry. We examined the clothes, jewellery, and books of the deceased. These were left under lock and key. We also found her dressing case, which we protected by seals, and took away with us to the Fiscal's office, along with all the other articles that we had discovered in the room. The next day we continued our examination in the house, having received in the interval fresh instructions from the Fiscal. We began our work in the bedroom communicating with the room in which Mrs. Macallan had died. It had been kept locked since the death. Finding nothing of any importance here, we went next to another room on the same floor, in which we were informed the prisoner was then lying ill in bed. His illness was described to us as a nervous complaint, caused by the death of his wife, and by the proceedings which had followed it. He was reported to be quite incapable of exerting himself, and quite unfit to see strangers. We insisted, nevertheless, in deference to our instructions, on obtaining admission to his room. He made no reply when we inquired whether he had or had not removed anything from the sleeping room next to his late wife's, which he usually occupied, to the sleeping room in which he now lay. All he did was to close his eyes, as if he were too feeble to speak to us or to notice us. Without further disturbing him, we began to examine the room and the different objects in it. While we were so employed, we were interrupted by a strange sound. We likened it to the rumbling of wheels in the corridor outside. The door opened, and there came swiftly in a gentleman, a cripple, wheeling himself along in a chair. He wheeled his chair straight up to a little table which stood by the prisoner's bedside, and said something to him in a whisper too low to be overheard. The prisoner opened his eyes, and quickly answered by a sign. We informed the crippled gentleman, quite respectfully, that we could not allow him to be in the room at this time. He appeared to think nothing of what we said. He only answered, "My name is Dexter. I am one of Mr. Macallan's old friends. It is you who are intruding here, not I." We again notified to him that he must leave the room; and we pointed out particularly that he had got his chair in such a position against the bedside table as to prevent us from examining it. He only laughed. "Can't you see for yourselves," he said, "that it is a table, and nothing more?" In reply to this, we warned him that we were acting under a legal warrant, and that he might get into trouble if he obstructed us in the execution of our duty. Finding there was no moving him by fair means, I took his chair and pulled it away, while Robert Lorry laid hold of the table and carried it to the other end of the room. The crippled gentleman flew into a furious rage with me for presuming to touch his chair. "My chair is me," he said. "How dare you lay hands on me?" I first opened the door, and then, by way of accommodating him, gave the chair a good push behind with my stick instead of my hand, and so sent it and him safely and swiftly out of the room. Having locked the door, so as to prevent any further intrusion, I joined Robert Lorry in examining the bedside table. It had one drawer in it, and that drawer we found secured. We asked the prisoner for the key. He flatly refused to give it to us, and said we had no right to unlock his drawers. He was so angry that he even declared it was lucky for us he was too weak to rise from his bed. I answered civilly that our duty obliged us to examine the drawer, and that if he still declined to produce the key he would only oblige us to take the table away and have the lock opened by a smith. While we were still disputing, there was a knock at the door of the room. I opened the door cautiously. Instead of the crippled gentleman, whom I had expected to see again, there was another stranger standing outside. The prisoner hailed him as a friend and neighbour, and eagerly called upon him for protection from us. We found this second gentleman pleasant enough to deal with. He informed us readily that he had been sent for by Mr. Dexter, and that he was himself a lawyer, and he asked to see our warrant. Having looked at it, he at once informed the prisoner, evidently very much to the prisoner's surprise, that he must submit to have the drawer examined, under protest. And then, without more ado, he got the key and opened the table drawer for us himself. We found inside several letters, and a large book with a lock to it, having the words "My Diary" inscribed on it in gilt letters. As a matter of course, we took possession of the letters and the diary, and sealed them up to be given to the Fiscal. At the same time, the gentleman wrote out a protest on the prisoner's behalf, and handed us his card. The card informed us that he was Mr. Playmore, now one of the agents for the prisoner. The card and the protests were deposited, with the other documents, in the care of the Fiscal. No other discoveries of any importance were made at Gleninch. Our next inquiries took us to Edinburgh, to the druggist whose label we had found on the crumpled morsel of paper, and to two other druggists likewise, whom we were instructed to question. On the 28th of October the Fiscal was in possession of all the information that we could collect, and our duties for the time being came to an end. This concluded the evidence of Schoolcraft and Lorry. It was not shaken on cross examination, and it was plainly unfavourable to the prisoner. Matters grew worse still when the next witnesses were called. The druggist, whose label had been found on the crumpled bit of paper, now appeared on the stand, to make the position of my unhappy husband more critical than ever. Andrew Kinlay, druggist, of Edinburgh, deposed as follows: "I keep a special registry book of the poisons sold by me. I produced the book. On the date therein mentioned, the prisoner at the bar, Mr. Eustace Macallan, came into my shop and said that he wished to purchase some arsenic. I asked him what it was wanted for. He told me it was wanted by his gardener to be used in solution for the killing of insects in the greenhouse. At the same time he mentioned his name, Mr. Macallan of Gleninch.
I at once directed my assistant to put up the arsenic, 2 ounces of it, and I made the necessary entry in my book. Mr. Macallan signed the entry, and I signed it afterward as witness. He paid for the arsenic, and took it away with him wrapped up in 2 papers, the outer paper being labelled with my name and address, and with the word "Poison" in large letters, exactly like the label now produced on the piece of paper found at Gleninch. The next witness, Peter Stockdale, also a druggist of Edinburgh, followed, and said: "The prisoner at the bar called at my shop on the date indicated on my register, some days later than the date indicated in the register of Mr. Kinlay. He wished to purchase 6 penny worth of arsenic. My assistant, to whom he had addressed himself, called me. It is a rule in my shop that no one sells poisons but myself. I asked the prisoner what he wanted the arsenic for. He answered that he wanted it for killing rats at his house, called Gleninch. I said, 'Have I the honour of speaking to Mr. Macallan of Gleninch?' He said that was his name. I sold him the arsenic, about 1 ounce and a half, and labelled the bottle in which I put it with the word 'Poison' in my own handwriting. He signed the register, and took the arsenic away with him, after paying for it." The cross examination of the 2 men succeeded in asserting certain technical objections to their evidence; but the terrible fact that my husband himself had actually purchased the arsenic in both cases remained unshaken. The next witnesses, the gardener and the cook at Gleninch, wound the chain of hostile evidence around the prisoner more mercilessly still. On examination, the gardener said, on his oath: "I never received any arsenic from the prisoner, or from any one else, at the date to which you refer, or at any other date. I never used any such thing as a solution of arsenic, or ever allowed the men working under me to use it, in the conservatories or in the garden at Gleninch. I disapprove of arsenic as a means of destroying noxious insects infesting flowers and plants." The cook, being called next, spoke as positively as the gardener. "Neither my master nor any other person gave me any arsenic to destroy rats at any time. No such thing was wanted. I declare on my oath that I never saw any rats in or about the house, or ever heard of any rats infesting it." Other household servants at Gleninch gave similar evidence. Nothing could be extracted from them on cross examination except that there might have been rats in the house, though they were not aware of it. The possession of the poison was traced directly to my husband, and to no one else. That he had bought it was actually proved; and that he had kept it was the one conclusion that the evidence justified. The witnesses who came next did their best to press the charge against the prisoner home to him. Having the arsenic in his possession, what had he done with it? The evidence led the jury to infer what he had done with it. The prisoner's valet deposed that his master had rung for him at 20 minutes to 10 on the morning of the day on which his mistress died, and had ordered a cup of tea for her. The man had received the order at the open door of Mrs. Macallan's room, and could positively swear that no other person but his master was there at the time. The under housemaid, appearing next, said that she had made the tea, and had herself taken it upstairs before 10 o'clock to Mrs. Macallan's room. Her master had received it from her at the open door. She could look in, and could see that he was alone in her mistress's room. The nurse, Christina Ormsay, being recalled, repeated what Mrs. Macallan had said to her on the day when that lady was first taken ill. She had said, speaking to the nurse at 6 o'clock in the morning: "Mr. Macallan came in about an hour since. He found me still sleepless, and gave me my composing draught." This was at 5 o'clock in the morning, while Christina Ormsay was asleep on the sofa. The nurse further swore that she had looked at the bottle containing the composing mixture, and had seen by the measuring marks on the bottle that a dose had been poured out since the dose previously given administered by herself. On this occasion special interest was excited by the cross examination. The closing questions put to the under housemaid and the nurse revealed for the first time what the nature of the defense was to be. Cross examining the under housemaid, the Dean of Faculty said: "Did you ever notice, when you were setting Mrs. Eustace Macallan's room to rights, whether the water left in the basin was of a blackish or bluish color?" The witness answered, "I never noticed anything of the sort." The Dean of Faculty went on: "Did you ever find under the pillow of the bed, or in any other hiding place in Mrs. Macallan's room, any books or pamphlets telling of remedies used for improving a bad complexion?" The witness answered, "No." The Dean of Faculty persisted. Did you ever hear Mrs. Macallan speak of arsenic, taken as a wash or taken as a medicine, as a good thing to improve the complexion?" The witness answered, "Never." Similar questions were next put to the nurse, and were all answered by this witness also in the negative. Here, then, in spite of the negative answers, was the plan of the defense made dimly visible for the first time to the jury and to the audience. By way of preventing the possibility of a mistake in so serious a matter, the Chief Judge (the Lord Justice Clerk) put this plain question when the witness had retired to the counsel for the defense. "The Court and the jury," said his lordship, "wish distinctly to understand the object of your cross examination of the housemaid and the nurse. Is it the theory of the defense that Mrs. Eustace Macallan used the arsenic which her husband purchased for the purpose of improving the defects of her complexion?" The Dean of Faculty answered, "That is what we say, my lord, and what we propose to prove as the foundation of the defense. We cannot dispute the medical evidence which declares that Mrs. Macallan died poisoned. But we assert that she died of an overdose of arsenic, ignorantly taken, in the privacy of her own room, as a remedy for the defects the proved and admitted defects of her complexion. The prisoner's declaration before the sheriff expressly sets forth that he purchased the arsenic at the request of his wife." The Lord Justice Clerk inquired upon this if there were any objection on the part of either of the learned counsel to have the declaration read in court before the trial proceeded further. To this the Dean of Faculty replied that he would be glad to have the declaration read. If he might use the expression, it would usefully pave the way in the minds of the jury for the defense which he had to submit to them. The Lord Advocate, speaking on the other side, was happy to be able to accommodate his learned brother in this matter. So long as the mere assertions which the declaration contained were not supported by proof, he looked upon that document as evidence for the prosecution, and he too was quite willing to have it read. Thereupon the prisoner's declaration of his innocence, on being charged before the sheriff with the murder of his wife, was read in the following terms: "I bought the 2 packets of arsenic, on each occasion at my wife's own request. On the first occasion she told me the poison was wanted by the gardener for use in the conservatories. On the second occasion she said it was required by the cook for ridding the lower part of the house of rats. I handed both packets of arsenic to my wife immediately on my return home. I had nothing to do with the poison after buying it. My wife was the person who gave orders to the gardener and cook, not I. I never held any communication with either of them. I asked my wife no questions about the use of the arsenic, feeling no interest in the subject. I never entered the conservatories for months together. I care little about flowers. As for the rats, I left the killing of them to the cook and the other servants, just as I should have left any other part of the domestic business to the cook and the other servants. My wife never told me she wanted the arsenic to improve her complexion. Surely I should be the last person admitted to the knowledge of such a secret of her toilet as that. I implicitly believe what she told me, viz., that the poison was wanted for the purpose specified by the gardener and the cook. I assert positively that I lived on friendly terms with my wife, allowing, of course, for the little occasional disagreements and misunderstandings of married life. Any sense of disappointment in connection with my marriage which I might have felt privately, I conceived it to be my duty, as a husband and as a gentleman, to conceal from my wife. I was not only shocked and grieved by her untimely death, I was filled with fear that I had not, with all my care, behaved affectionately enough to her in her lifetime. Furthermore, I solemnly declare that I know no more of how she took the arsenic found in her body than the babe unborn. I am innocent even of the thought of harming that unhappy woman. I administered the composing draught exactly as I found it in the bottle. I afterward gave her the cup of tea exactly as I received it from the under housemaid's hand. I never had access to the arsenic after I placed the 2 packages in my wife's possession. I am entirely ignorant of what she did with them, or where she kept them. I declare before God I am innocent of the horrible crime with which I am charged." With the reading of those true and touching words, the proceedings on the second day of the trial came to an end. So far, I must own, the effect on me of reading the report was to depress my spirits and to lower my hopes. The whole weight of the evidence at the close of the second day was against my unhappy husband. Woman as I was, and partisan as I was, I could plainly see that. The merciless Lord Advocate I confess I hated him had proved, 1. That Eustace had bought the poison; 2. That the reason which he had given to the druggist for buying the poison was not the true reason; 3. That he had two opportunities of secretly administering the poison to his wife. On the other hand, what had the Dean of Faculty proved? As yet, nothing. The assertions in the prisoner's declaration of his innocence were still, as the Lord Advocate had remarked, assertions not supported by proof. Not one atom of evidence had been produced to show that it was the wife who had secretly used the arsenic, and used it for her complexion. My one consolation was that the reading of the Trial had already revealed to me the helpful figures of two friends on whose sympathy I might surely rely. The crippled Mr. Dexter had especially shown himself to be a thorough good ally of my husband's. My heart warmed to the man who had moved his chair against the bedside table, the man who had struggled to the last to defend Eustace's papers from the wretches who had seized them. I decided then and there that the first person to whom I would confide my aspirations and my hopes should be Mr. Dexter. If he felt any difficulty about advising me, I would then apply next to the agent, Mr. Playmore, the second good friend, who had formerly protested against the seizure of my husband's papers. Fortified by this resolution, I turned the page, and read the history of the third day of the Trial. End of Chapter 17. Of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 18. Third question. What was his motive? The first question, did the woman die poisoned, had been answered positively. The second question, who poisoned her, had been answered apparently. There now remained the third and final question. What was his motive? The first evidence called in answer to that inquiry was the evidence of relatives and friends of the dead wife. Lady Brydehaven, widow of Rear Admiral Sir George Brydehaven, examined by Mr. Drew, counsel for the Crown with the Lord Advocate, gave evidence as follows. The deceased lady, Mrs. Eustace Macallan, was my niece. She was the only child of my sister, and she lived under my roof after the time of her mother's death. I objected to her marriage, on grounds which were considered purely fanciful and sentimental by her other friends. It is extremely painful to me to state the circumstances in public, but I am ready to make the sacrifice if the ends of justice require it. The prisoner at the bar, at the time of which I am now speaking, was staying as a guest in my house. He met with an accident while he was out riding, which caused a serious injury to one of his legs. The leg had been previously hurt while he was serving with the army in India. This circumstance tended greatly to aggravate the injury received in the accident. He was confined to a recumbent position on a sofa for many weeks together, and the ladies in the house took it in turns to sit with him, and while away the weary time by reading to him and talking to him. My niece was foremost among those volunteer nurses. She played admirably on the piano, and the sick man happened, most unfortunately as the event proved, to be fond of music. The consequences of the perfectly innocent intercourse thus begun were deplorable consequences for my niece. She became passionately attached to Mr. Eustace Macallan, without awakening any corresponding affection on his side. I did my best to interfere, delicately and usefully, while it was still possible to interfere with advantage. Unhappily, my niece refused to place any confidence in me. She persistently denied that she was actuated by any warmer feeling toward Mr. Macallan than a feeling of friendly interest. This made it impossible for me to separate them without openly acknowledging my reason for doing so, and thus producing a scandal which might have affected my niece's reputation. My husband was alive at that time, and the one thing I could do under the circumstances was the thing I did. I requested him to speak privately to Mr. Macallan, and to appeal to his honour to help us out of the difficulty without prejudice to my niece. Mr. Macallan behaved admirably. He was still helpless, but he made an excuse for leaving us, which it was impossible to dispute. In 2 days after my husband had spoken to him, he was removed from the house. The remedy was well intended, but it came too late, and it utterly failed. The mischief was done. My niece pined away visibly. Neither medical help nor change of air and scene did anything for her. In course of time, after Mr. Macallan had recovered from the effects of his accident, I found that she was carrying on a clandestine correspondence with him by means of her maid. His letters, I am bound to say, were most considerately and carefully written. Nevertheless, I felt it my duty to stop the correspondence. My interference what else could I do but interfere? Brought matters to a crisis. One day my niece was missing at breakfast time. The next day we discovered that the poor infatuated creature had gone to Mr. Macallan's chambers in London, and had been found hidden in his bedroom by some bachelor friend who came to visit him. For this disaster Mr. Macallan was in no respect to blame. Hearing footsteps outside, he had only time to take measures for saving her character by concealing her in the nearest room, and the nearest room happened to be his bedchamber. The matter was talked about, of course, and motives were misinterpreted in the vilest manner. My husband had another private conversation with Mr. Macallan. He again behaved admirably. He publicly declared that my niece had visited him as his betrothed wife. In a fortnight from that time he silenced scandal in the one way that was possible he married her. I was alone in opposing the marriage. I thought it at the time what it has proved to be since a fatal mistake. It would have been sad enough if Mr. Macallan had only married her without a particle of love on his side. But to make the prospect more hopeless still, he was at that very time the victim of a misplaced attachment to a lady who was engaged to another man. I am well aware that he compassionately denied this, just as he compassionately affected to be in love with my niece when he married her. But his hopeless admiration of the lady whom I have mentioned was a matter of fact notorious among his friends. It may not be amiss to add that her marriage preceded his marriage. He had irretrievably lost the woman he really loved; he was without a hope or an aspiration in life, when he took pity on my niece. In conclusion, I can only repeat that no evil which could have happened, if she had remained a single woman, would have been comparable, in my opinion, to the evil of such a marriage as this. Never, I sincerely believe, were two more ill assorted persons united in the bonds of matrimony than the prisoner at the bar and his deceased wife. The evidence of this witness produced a strong sensation among the audience, and had a marked effect on the minds of the jury. Cross-examination forced Lady Brydehaven to modify some of her opinions, and to acknowledge that the hopeless attachment of the prisoner to another woman was a matter of rumour only. But the facts in the narrative remained unshaken, and for that one reason they invested the crime charged against the prisoner with an appearance of possibility, which it had entirely failed to assume during the earlier part of the trial. Two other ladies, intimate friends of Mrs. Eustace Macallan, were called next. They differed from Lady Brydehaven in their opinions on the propriety of the marriage, but on all the material points they supported her testimony, and confirmed the serious impression which the first witness had produced on every person in court. The next evidence which the prosecution proposed to put in was the silent evidence of the letters and the diary found at Gleninch. In answer to a question from the bench, the Lord Advocate stated that the letters were written by friends of the prisoner and his deceased wife, and that passages in them bore directly on the terms on which the two associated in their married life. The diary was still more valuable as evidence. It contained the prisoner's daily records of domestic events, and of the thoughts and feelings which they aroused in him at the time. A most painful scene followed this explanation. Writing as I do, long after the events took place, I still cannot prevail upon myself to describe in detail what my unhappy husband said and did at this distressing period of the trial. Deeply affected while Lady Brydehaven was giving her evidence, he had with difficulty restrained himself from interrupting her. He now lost all control over his feelings. In piercing tones, which rang through the court, he protested against the contemplated violation of his own most sacred secrets and his wife's most sacred secrets. "Hang me, innocent as I am!" he cried, "but spare me that!" The effect of this terrible outbreak on the audience is reported to have been indescribable. Some of the women present were in hysterics. The judges interfered from the bench, but with no good result. Quiet was at length restored by the Dean of Faculty, who succeeded in soothing the prisoner, and who then addressed the judges, pleading for indulgence to his unhappy client in most touching and eloquent language. The speech, a masterpiece of impromptu oratory, concluded with a temperate yet strongly urged protest against the reading of the papers discovered at Gleninch. The three judges retired to consider the legal question submitted to them. The sitting was suspended for more than half an hour. As usual in such cases, the excitement in the court communicated itself to the crowd outside in the street. The general opinion here, led as it was supposed by one of the clerks or other inferior persons connected with the legal proceedings, was decidedly adverse to the prisoner's chance of escaping a sentence of death. "If the letters and the diary are read," said the brutal spokesman of the mob, "the letters and the diary will hang him." On the return of the judges into court, it was announced that they had decided, by a majority of 2 to 1, on permitting the documents in dispute to be produced in evidence. Each of the judges, in turn, gave his reasons for the decision at which he had arrived. This done, the trial proceeded. The reading of the extracts from the letters and the extracts from the diary began. The first letters produced were the letters found in the Indian cabinet in Mrs. Eustace Macallan's room. They were addressed to the deceased lady by intimate female friends of her, with whom she was accustomed to correspond. 3 separate extracts from letters written by 3 different correspondents were selected to be read in court. First Correspondent: I despair, my dearest Sarah, of being able to tell you how your last letter has distressed me. Pray forgive me if I own to thinking that your very sensitive nature exaggerates or misinterprets, quite unconsciously of course, the neglect that you experience at the hands of your husband. I cannot say anything about his peculiarities of character, because I am not well enough acquainted with him to know what they are. But, my dear, I am much older than you, and I have had a much longer experience than yours of what somebody calls the lights and shadows of married life. Speaking from that experience, I must tell you what I have observed. Young married women, like you, who are devotedly attached to their husbands, are apt to make one very serious mistake. As a rule, they all expect too much from their husbands. Men, my poor Sarah, are not like us. Their love, even when it is quite sincere, is not like our love. It does not last as it does with us. It is not the one hope and one thought of their lives, as it is with us. We have no alternative, even when we most truly respect and love them, but to make allowances for this difference between the man's nature and the woman's. I do not for one moment excuse your husband's coldness. He is wrong, for example, in never looking at you when he speaks to you, and in never noticing the efforts that you make to please him. He is worse than wrong, he is really cruel, if you like, in never returning your kiss when you kiss him. But, my dear, are you quite sure that he is always designedly cold and cruel? May not his conduct be sometimes the result of troubles and anxieties which weigh on his mind, and which are troubles and anxieties that you cannot share? If you try to look at his behavior in this light, you will understand many things which puzzle and pain you now. Be patient with him, my child. Make no complaints, and never approach him with your caresses at times when his mind is preoccupied or his temper ruffled. This may be hard advice to follow, loving him as ardently as you do. But rely on it, the secret of happiness for us women is to be found, alas, only too often, in such exercise of restraint and resignation as your old friend now recommends. Think, my dear, over what I have written, and let me hear from you again. Second Correspondent: How can you be so foolish, Sarah, as to waste your love on such a cold-blooded brute as your husband seems to be? To be sure, I am not married yet, or perhaps I should not be so surprised at you. But I shall be married one of these days, and if my husband ever treats me as Mr. Macallan treats you, I shall insist on a separation. I declare, I think I would rather be actually beaten, like the women among the lower orders, than be treated with the polite neglect and contempt which you describe. I burn with indignation when I think of it. It must be quite insufferable. Don't bear it any longer, my poor dear. Leave him, and come and stay with me. My brother is a lawyer, as you know. I read to him portions of your letter, and he is of opinion that you might get what he calls a judicial separation. Come and consult him. Third Correspondent: You know, my dear Mrs. Macallan, what my experience of men has been. Your letter does not surprise me in the least. Your husband's conduct to you points to one conclusion. He is in love with some other woman. There is somebody in the dark who gets from him everything that he denies to you. I have been through it all, and I know. Don't give way. Make it the business of your life to find out who the creature is. Perhaps there may be more than one of them. It doesn't matter. One or many, if you can only discover them, you may make his existence as miserable to him as he makes your existence to you. If you want my experience to help you, say the word, and it is freely at your service. I can come and stay with you at Gleninch any time after the 4th of next month." With those abominable lines, the readings from the letters of the women came to an end. The first and longest of the extracts produced the most vivid impression in court. Evidently the writer was in this case a worthy and sensible person. It was generally felt, however, that all three of the letters, no matter how widely they might differ in tone, justified the same conclusion. The wife's position at Gleninch, if the wife's account of it were to be trusted, was the position of a neglected and an unhappy woman. The correspondence of the prisoner, which had been found, with his diary, in the locked bed table drawer, was produced next. The letters in this case were, with one exception, all written by men. Though the tone of them was moderation itself, as compared with the second and third of the women's letters, the conclusion still pointed the same way. The life of the husband at Gleninch appeared to be just as intolerable as the life of the wife. For example, one of the prisoner's male friends wrote inviting him to make a yacht voyage around the world. Another suggested an absence of 6 months on the Continent. A third recommended field sports and fishing. The one object aimed at by all the writers was plainly to counsel a separation, more or less plausible and more or less complete, between the married pair. The last letter read was addressed to the prisoner in a woman's handwriting, and was signed by a woman's Christian name only. "Ah, my poor Eustace, what a cruel destiny is ours!" the letter began. "When I think of your life sacrificed to that wretched woman, my heart bleeds for you. If we had been man and wife, if it had been my unutterable happiness to love and cherish the best, the dearest of men, what a paradise of our own we might have lived in! What delicious hours we might have known! But regret is vain. We are separated in this life separated by ties which we both mourn, and yet which we must both respect. My Eustace, there is a world beyond this. There our souls will fly to meet each other, and mingle in one long, heavenly embrace, in a rapture forbidden to us on earth. The misery described in your letter oh, why did you marry her? Has wrung this confession of feeling from me. Let it comfort you, but let no other eyes see it. Burn my rashly written lines, and look as I look to the better life which you may yet share with your own Helena." The reading of this outrageous letter provoked a question from the bench. One of the judges asked if the writer had attached any date or address to the letter. In answer to this, the Lord Advocate stated that neither the one nor the other appeared. The envelope showed that the letter had been posted in London. "We propose," the learned counsel continued, "to read certain passages from the prisoner's diary, in which the name signed at the end of the letter occurs more than once, and we may possibly find other means of identifying the writer, to the satisfaction of your lordship, before the trial is over." The promised passages from my husband's private diary were now read. The first extract related to a period of nearly a year before the date of Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death. It was expressed in these terms: "News by this morning's post, which has quite overwhelmed me. Helena's husband died suddenly 2 days since of heart disease. She is free. My beloved Helena is free. And I am fettered to a woman with whom I have not a single feeling in common. Helena is lost to me by my own act. Ah! I can understand now, as I never understood before, how irresistible temptation can be, and how easily sometimes crime may follow it. I had better shut up these leaves for the night. It maddens me to no purpose to think of my position or to write of it." The next passage, dated a few days later, dwelt on the same subject. "Of all the follies that a man can commit, the greatest is acting on impulse. I acted on impulse when I married the unfortunate creature who is now my wife. Helena was then lost to me, as I too hastily supposed. She had married the man to whom she rashly engaged herself before she met with me. She was younger than I, and to all appearance heartier and stronger than I. So far as I could see, my fate was sealed for life. Helena had written her farewell letter, taking leave of me in this world for good. My prospects were closed, my hopes had ended. I had not an aspiration left; I had no necessity to stimulate me to take refuge in work. A chivalrous action, an exertion of noble self denial, seemed to be all that was left to me, and that I was fit for. The circumstances of the moment adapted themselves with a fatal facility to this idea. The ill-fated woman who had become attached to me Heaven knows, without so much as the shadow of encouragement on my part had, just at that time, rashly placed her reputation at the mercy of the world. It rested with me to silence the scandalous tongues that reviled her. With Helena lost to me, happiness was not to be expected. All women were equally indifferent to me. A generous action would be the salvation of this woman. Why not perform it? I married her on that impulse married her just as I might have jumped into the water and saved her if she had been drowning, just as I might have knocked a man down if I had seen him ill treating her in the street. And now the woman for whom I have made this sacrifice stands between me and my Helena. My Helena, free to pour out all the treasures of her love on the man who adores the earth that she touches with her foot. Fool! Madman! Why don't I dash out my brains against the wall that I see opposite to me while I write these lines? My gun is there in the corner. I have only to tie a string to the trigger, and to put the muzzle to my mouth. No! My mother is alive. My mother's love is sacred. I have no right to take the life which she gave me. I must suffer and submit. Oh, Helena! Helena! The third extract, one among many similar passages, had been written about 2 months before the death of the prisoner's wife. More reproaches addressed to me. There never was such a woman for complaining. She lives in a perfect atmosphere of ill temper and discontent. My new offenses are 2 in number. I never ask her to play to me now; and when she puts on a new dress expressly to please me, I never notice it. Notice it! Good heavens, the effort of my life is not to notice her in anything she does or says. How could I keep my temper unless I kept as much as possible out of the way of private interviews with her? And I do keep my temper. I am never hard on her. I never use harsh language to her. She has a double claim on my forbearance. She is a woman, and the law has made her my wife. I remember this; but I am human. The less I see of her, except when visitors are present, the more certain I can feel of preserving my self control. I wonder what it is that makes her so utterly distasteful to me. She is a plain woman, but I have seen uglier women than she whose caresses I could have endured without the sense of shrinking that comes over me when I am obliged to submit to her caresses. I keep the feeling hidden from her. She loves me, poor thing, and I pity her. I wish I could do more. I wish I could return in the smallest degree the feeling with which she regards me. But no, I can only pity her. If she would be content to live on friendly terms with me, and never to exact demonstrations of tenderness, we might get on pretty well. But she wants love. Unfortunate creature, she wants love. Oh, my Helena, I have no love to give her. My heart is yours. I dreamed last night that this unhappy wife of mine was dead. The dream was so vivid that I actually got out of my bed and opened the door of her room and listened. Her calm, regular breathing was distinctly audible in the stillness of the night. She was in a deep sleep. I closed the door again, and lighted my candle, and read. Helena was in all my thoughts. It was hard work to fix my attention on the book. But anything was better than going to bed again, and dreaming, perhaps for the second time, that I too was free. What a life mine is! What a life my wife's is! If the house were to take fire, I wonder whether I should make an effort to save myself or to save her. The last 2 passages read referred to later dates still. A gleam of brightness has shone over this dismal existence of mine at last. Helena is no longer condemned to the seclusion of widowhood. Time enough has passed to permit of her mixing again in society. She is paying visits to friends in our part of Scotland; and as she and I are cousins, it is universally understood that she cannot leave the North without also spending a few days at my house. She writes me word that the visit, however embarrassing it may be to us privately, is nevertheless a visit that must be made for the sake of appearances. Blessings on appearances! I shall see this angel in my purgatory, and all because society in Midlothian would think it strange that my cousin should be visiting in my part of Scotland and not visit me. But we are to be very careful, Helena says in so many words. I come to see you, Eustace, as a sister. You must receive me as a brother, or not receive me at all. I shall write to your wife to propose the day for my visit. I shall not forget. Do you not forget.
that it is by your wife's permission that I enter your house. Only let me see her. I will submit to anything to obtain the unutterable happiness of seeing her." The last extract followed, and consisted of these lines only: "A new misfortune. My wife has fallen ill. She has taken to her bed with a bad rheumatic cold, just at the time appointed for Helena's visit to Gleninch; but on this occasion, I gladly own it, she has behaved charmingly. She has written to Helena to say that her illness is not serious enough to render a change necessary in the arrangements, and make it her particular request that my cousin's visit shall take place upon the day originally decided on. This is a great sacrifice made to me on my wife's part. Jealous of every woman under 40 who comes near me, she is, of course, jealous of Helena; and she controls herself, and trusts me. I am bound to show my gratitude for this, and I will show it. From this day forth, I vow to live more affectionately with my wife. I tenderly embraced her this very morning, and I hope, poor soul, she did not discover the effort that it cost me." There the readings from the Diary came to an end. The most unpleasant page in the whole report of the Trial were, to me, the pages which contained the extract from my husband's Diary. There were expressions here and there which not only pained me, but which always shook Eustace's position in my estimation. I think I would have given everything I possessed to have had the power of annihilating certain lines in the Diary. As for his passionate expressions of love for Mrs. Beauly, every one of them went through me like a sting. He had whispered words quite as warm into my ears in the days of his courtship. I had no reason to doubt that he truly and dearly loved me. But the question was, had he just as truly and dearly loved Mrs. Beauly before me? Had she or I won the first love of his heart? He had declared to me, over and over again, that he had only fancied himself to be in love before the day when we met. I had believed him then. I determined to believe him still. I did believe him. But I hated Mrs. Beauly. As for the painful impression produced in court by the readings from the letters and the Diary, it seemed to be impossible to increase it. Nevertheless, it was perceptibly increased. In other words, it was rendered more unfavourable still toward the prisoner by the evidence of the next and last witness called on the part of the prosecution. William Enzie, under gardener at Gleninch, was sworn and deposed as follows: On the 20th of October, at 11 o'clock in the forenoon, I was sent to work in the shrubbery, on the side next to the garden called the Dutch Garden. There was a summer house in the Dutch Garden, having its back set toward the shrubbery. The day was wonderfully fine and warm for the time of year. Passing to my work, I passed the back of the summer house. I heard voices inside, a man's voice and a lady's voice. The lady's voice was strange to me. The man's voice I recognized as the voice of my master. The ground in the shrubbery was soft, and my curiosity was excited. I stepped up to the back of the summer house, without being heard, and I listened to what was going on inside. The first words I could distinguish were spoken in my master's voice. He said, "If I could only have foreseen that you might one day be free, what a happy man I might have been!" The lady's voice answered, "Hush! You must not talk so." My master said upon that, "I must talk of what is in my mind. It is always in my mind that I have lost you." He stopped a bit there, and then he said on a sudden, "Do me one favour, my angel. Promise me not to marry again." The lady's voice spoke out thereupon sharply enough. "What do you mean?" My master said, "I wish no harm to the unhappy creature who is a burden on my life, but suppose " "Suppose nothing," the lady said. "Come back to the house." She led the way into the garden, and turned round, beckoning my master to join her. In that position I saw her face plainly, and I knew it for the face of the young widow lady who was visiting at the house. She was pointed out to me by the head gardener when she first arrived, for the purpose of warning me that I was not to interfere if I found her picking the flowers. The gardens at Gleninch were shown to tourists on certain days, and we made a difference, of course, in the matter of the flowers, between strangers and guests staying in the house. I am quite certain of the identity of the lady who was talking with my master. Mrs. Beauly was a comely person, and there was no mistaking her for any other than herself. She and my master withdrew together on the way to the house. I heard nothing more of what passed between them. The witness was severely cross examined as to the correctness of his recollection of the talk in the summer house, and as to his capacity for identifying both the speakers. On certain minor points he was shaken.
but he firmly asserted his accurate remembrance of the last words exchanged between his master and Mrs. Beauly; and he personally described the lady in terms which proved that he had correctly identified her. With this the answer to the third question raised by the Trial the question of the prisoner's motive for poisoning his wife came to an end. The story for the prosecution was now a story told. The staunchest friends of the prisoner in court were compelled to acknowledge that the evidence thus far pointed clearly and conclusively against him. He seemed to feel this himself. When he withdrew at the close of the third day of the Trial he was so depressed and exhausted that he was obliged to lean on the arm of the governor of the jail. Chapter 18.
Number 19 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 19. The Evidence for the Defense. The feeling of interest excited by the Trial was prodigiously increased on the fourth day. The witnesses for the defense were now to be heard, and first and foremost among them appeared the prisoner's mother. She looked at her son as she lifted her veil to take the oath. He burst into tears. At that moment the sympathy felt for the mother was generally extended to the unhappy son. Examined by the Dean of Faculty, Mrs. Macallan the elder gave her answers with remarkable dignity and self-control. Questioned as to certain private conversations which had passed between her late daughter-in-law and herself, she declared that Mrs. Eustace Macallan was morbidly sensitive on the subject of her personal appearance. She was devotedly attached to her husband; the great anxiety of her life was to make herself as attractive to him as possible. The imperfections in her personal appearance, and especially in her complexion, were subjects to her of the bitterest regret. The witness had heard her say, over and over again, referring to her complexion, that there was no risk she would not run, and no pain she would not suffer, to improve it. "Men," she had said, "are all caught by outward appearances. My husband might love me better if I had a better color." Being asked next if the passages from her son's Diary were to be depended on as evidence, that is to say, if they fairly represented the peculiarities in his character, and his true sentiments towards his wife, Mrs. Macallan denied it in the plainest and strongest terms. "The extracts from my son's Diary are a libel on his character," she said, "and not the less a libel because they happen to be written by himself. Speaking from a mother's experience of him, I know that he must have written the passages produced in moments of uncontrollable depression and despair. No just person judges hastily of a man by the rash words which may escape him in his moody and miserable moments. Is my son to be judged because he happens to have written his rash words instead of speaking them? His pen has been his most deadly enemy in this case. It has presented him at his very worst. He was not happy in his marriage, I admit that. But I say at the same time that he was invariably considerate toward his wife. I was implicitly trusted by both of them. I saw them in their most private moments. I declare, in the face of what he appears to have written to her friends and correspondents, that my son never gave his wife any just cause to assert that he treated her with cruelty or neglect." The words, firmly and clearly spoken, produced a strong impression. The Lord Advocate, evidently perceiving that any attempt to weaken that impression would not be likely to succeed, confined himself in cross examination to two significant questions. "In speaking to you of the defects in her complexion," he said, "did your daughter in law refer in any way to the use of arsenic as a remedy?" The answer to this was No. The Lord Advocate proceeded: "Did you yourself ever recommend arsenic, or mention it casually, in the course of the private conversations which you have described?" The answer to this was Never. The Lord Advocate resumed his seat. Mrs. Macallan the elder withdrew. An interest of a new kind was excited by the appearance of the next witness. This was no less a person than Mrs. Beauly herself. The report describes her as a remarkably attractive person, modest and ladylike in her manner, and, to all appearance, feeling sensitively the public position in which she was placed. The first portion of her evidence was almost a recapitulation of the evidence given by the prisoner's mother, with this difference, that Mrs. Beauly had been actually questioned by the deceased lady on the subject of cosmetic applications to the complexion.
Mrs. Eustace Macallan had complimented her on the beauty of her complexion, and had asked what artificial means she used to keep it in such good order. Using no artificial means, and knowing nothing whatever of cosmetics, Mrs. Beauly had resented the question, and a temporary coolness between the two ladies had been the result. Interrogated as to her relations with the prisoner, Mrs. Beauly indignantly denied that she or Mr. Macallan had ever given the deceased lady the slightest cause for jealousy. It was impossible for Mrs. Beauly to leave Scotland, after visiting at the houses of her cousin's neighbors, without also visiting at her cousin's house. To take any other course would have been an act of downright rudeness, and would have excited remark. She did not deny that Mr. Macallan had admired her in the days when they were both single people. But there was no further expression of that feeling when she had married another man, and when he had married another woman. From that time their intercourse was the innocent intercourse of a brother and sister. Mr. Macallan was a gentleman. He knew what was due to his wife and to Mrs. Beauly. She would not have entered the house if experience had not satisfied her of that. As for the evidence of the under gardener, it was little better than pure invention. The greater part of the conversation which he had described himself as overhearing had never taken place. The little that was really said, as the man reported it, was said jestingly, and she had checked it immediately, as the witness had himself confessed. For the rest, Mr. Macallan's behavior toward his wife was invariably kind and considerate. He was constantly devising means to alleviate her sufferings from the rheumatic affection which confined her to her bed. He had spoken of her, not once but many times, in terms of the sincerest sympathy. When she ordered her husband and witness to leave the room, on the day of her death, Mr. Macallan said to witness afterwards, "We must bear with her jealousy, poor soul. We know that we don't deserve it." In that patient manner he submitted to her infirmities of temper from first to last. The main interest in the cross examination of Mrs. Beauly centered in a question which was put at the end. After reminding her that she had given her name, on being sworn, as Helena Beauly, the Lord Advocate said, "A letter addressed to the prisoner, and signed 'Helena,' has been read in Court. Look at it, if you please. Are you the writer of that letter?" Before the witness could reply, the Dean of Faculty protested against the question. The Judges allowed the protest, and refused to permit the question to be put. Mrs. Beauly thereupon withdrew. She had betrayed a very perceptible agitation on hearing the letter referred to, and on having it placed in her hands. This exhibition of feeling was variously interpreted among the audience. Upon the whole, however, Mrs. Beauly's evidence was considered to have aided the impression which the mother's evidence had produced in the prisoner's favor. The next witnesses, both ladies, and both school friends of Mrs. Eustace Macallan, created a new feeling of interest in court. They supplied the missing link in the evidence for the defense. The first of the ladies declared that she had mentioned arsenic as a means of improving the complexion in conversation with Mrs. Eustace Macallan. She had never used it herself, but she had read of the practice of eating arsenic among the Styrian peasantry for the purpose of clearing the color, and of producing a general appearance of plumpness and good health. She positively swore that she had related this result of her reading to the deceased lady exactly as she now related it in court. The second witness, present at the conversation already mentioned, corroborated the first witness in every particular, and added that she had procured the book relating to the arsenic-eating practices of the Styrian peasantry, and their results, at Mrs. Eustace Macallan's own request. The book she had herself dispatched by post to Mrs. Eustace Macallan at Gleninch. There was but one assailable point in this otherwise conclusive evidence. The cross examination discovered it. Both the ladies were asked, in turn, if Mrs. Eustace Macallan had expressed to them, directly or indirectly, any intention of obtaining arsenic, with a view to the improvement of her complexion. In each case the answer to that all important question was No. Mrs. Eustace Macallan had heard of the remedy, and had received the book; but of her own intentions in the future she had not said one word. She had begged both the ladies to consider the conversation as strictly private, and there it had ended. It required no lawyer's eye to discern the fatal defect which was now revealed in the evidence for the defense. Every intelligent person present could see that the prisoner's chance of an honorable acquittal depended on tracing the poison to the possession of his wife, or at least on proving her expressed intention to obtain it. In either of these cases, the prisoner's declaration of his innocence would claim the support of testimony, which, however indirect it might be, no honest and intelligent man would be likely to resist. Was that testimony forthcoming?
Was the counsel for the defense not at the end of his resources yet? The crowded audience waited in breathless expectation for the appearance of the next witness. A whisper went round among certain well instructed persons that the Court was now to see and hear the prisoner's old friend, already often referred to in the course of the trial as "Mr. Dexter." After a brief interval of delay there was a sudden commotion among the audience, accompanied by suppressed exclamations of curiosity and surprise. At the same moment the crier summoned the new witness by the extraordinary name of Miserrimus Dexter. End of chapter 19. Of the Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 20. The End of the Trial. The calling of the new witness provoked a burst of laughter among the audience, due partly, no doubt, to the strange name by which he had been summoned, partly also to the instinctive desire of all crowded assemblies, when their interest is painfully excited, to seize on any relief in the shape of the first subject of merriment which may present itself. A severe rebuke from the bench restored order among the audience. The Lord Justice Clerk declared that he would clear the Court if the interruption to the proceedings were renewed. During the silence which followed this announcement, the new witness appeared, gliding, self propelled in his chair on wheels, through the opening made for him among the crowd. A strange and startling creature, literally the half of a man, revealed himself to the general view. A coverlet which had been thrown over his chair had fallen off during his progress through the throng. The loss of it exposed to the public curiosity the head, the arms, and the trunk of a living human being, absolutely deprived of the lower limbs. To make his deformity all the more striking and all the more terrible, the victim of it was, as to his face and his body, an unusually handsome and an unusually well made man. His long silky hair, of a bright and beautiful chestnut color, fell over shoulders that were the perfection of strength and grace. His face was bright with vivacity and intelligence. His large, clear blue eyes and his long, delicate white hands were like the eyes and hands of a beautiful woman. He would have looked effeminate but for the manly proportions of his throat and chest, aided in their effect by his flowing beard and long moustache, of a lighter chestnut shade than the color of his hair. Never had a magnificent head and body been more hopelessly ill bestowed than in this instance. Never had Nature committed a more careless or a more cruel mistake than in the making of this man. He had sworn, seated of course in his chair. Having given his name, he bowed to the judges and requested their permission to preface his evidence with a word of explanation. "People generally laugh when they first hear my strange Christian name," he said, in a low, clear, resonant voice which penetrated to the remotest corners of the Court. "I may inform the good people here that many names, still common among us, have their significations, and that mine is one of them. Alexander, for instance, means, in the Greek, a helper of men. David means, in Hebrew, well beloved. Francis means, in German, free. My name, Miserrimus, means, in Latin, most unhappy. It was given to me by my father, in allusion to the deformity which you all see, the deformity with which it was my misfortune to be born. You won't laugh at Miserrimus again, will you?" He turned to the Dean of Faculty, waiting to examine him for the defense. "Mr. Dean, I am at your service. I apologize for delaying, even for a moment, the proceedings of the Court." He delivered his little address with perfect grace and good humor. Examined by the Dean, he gave his evidence clearly, without the slightest appearance of hesitation or reserve. "I was staying at Gleninch as a guest in the house at the time of Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death," he began. "Dr. Jerome and Mr. Gale desired to see me at a private interview, the prisoner being then in a state of prostration which made it impossible for him to attend to his duties as master of the house. At this interview, the two doctors astonished and horrified me by declaring that Mrs. Eustace Macallan had died poisoned. They left it to me to communicate the dreadful news to her husband, and they warned me that a post mortem examination must be held on the body. If the Fiscal had seen my old friend when I communicated the doctor's message, I doubt if he would have ventured to charge the prisoner with the murder of his wife. To my mind, the charge was nothing less than an outrage.
I resisted the seizure of the prisoner's Diary and letters, animated by that feeling. Now that the Diary has been produced, I agree with the prisoner's mother in denying that it is fair evidence to bring against him. A Diary, when it extends beyond a bare record of facts and dates, is nothing but an expression of the poorest and weakest side in the character of the person who keeps it. It is, in 9 cases out of 10, the more or less contemptible outpouring of vanity and conceit which the writer dare not exhibit to any mortal but himself. I am the prisoner's oldest friend. I solemnly declare that I never knew he could write downright nonsense until I heard his Diary read in this court. He kill his wife! He treat his wife with neglect and cruelty! I venture to say, from 20 years' experience of him, that there is no man in this assembly who is constitutionally more incapable of crime and more incapable of cruelty than the man who stands at the bar. While I am about it, I go further still. I even doubt whether a man capable of crime and capable of cruelty could have found it in his heart to do evil to the woman whose untimely death is the subject of this inquiry. I have heard what the ignorant and prejudiced nurse, Christina Ormsay, has said of the deceased lady. From my own personal observation, I contradict every word of it. Mrs. Eustace Macallan, granting her personal defects, was nevertheless one of the most charming women I ever met with. She was highly bred, in the best sense of the word. I never saw in any other person so sweet a smile as hers, or such grace and beauty of movement as hers. If you liked music, she sang beautifully, and few professed musicians had such a touch on the piano as hers. If you prefer talking, I never yet met with the man, or even the woman, which is saying a great deal more, whom her conversation could not charm. To say that such a wife as this could be first cruelly neglected, and then barbarously murdered, by the man no, by the martyr who stands there, is to tell me that the sun never shines at noonday, and that the heaven is not above the earth. Oh, yes, I know that the letters of her friends show that she wrote to them in bitter complaint of her husband's conduct to her. But remember what one of those friends, the wisest and the best of them, says in reply. "I own to thinking," she writes, "that your sensitive nature exaggerates or misinterprets the neglect that you experience at the hands of your husband." There, in that one sentence, is the whole truth. Mrs. Eustace Macallan's nature was the imaginative, self tormenting nature of a poet. No mortal love could ever have been refined enough for her. Trifles that women of a coarser moral fibre would have passed over without notice were causes of downright agony to that exquisitely sensitive temperament. There are persons born to be unhappy: that poor lady was one of them. When I have said this, I have said all. No, there is one word more still to be added. It may be as well to remind the prosecution that Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death was in the pecuniary sense a serious loss to her husband. He had insisted on having the whole of her fortune settled on herself, and on her relatives after her, when he married. Her income from that fortune helped to keep in splendour the house and grounds at Gleninch. The prisoner's own resources, aided even by his mother's jointure, were quite inadequate fitly to defray the expenses of living at his splendid country seat. Knowing all the circumstances, I can positively assert that the wife's death has deprived the husband of 2/3 of his income; and the prosecution, viewing him as the basest and cruelest of men, declares that he deliberately killed her, with all his pecuniary interests pointing to the preservation of her life. It is useless to ask me whether I noticed anything in the conduct of the prisoner or Mrs. Beauly which might justify a wife's jealousy. I never observed Mrs. Beauly with any attention, and I never encouraged the prisoner in talking to me about her. He was a general admirer of pretty women, so far as I know, in a perfectly innocent way. That he could prefer Mrs. Beauly to his wife is inconceivable to me, unless he were out of his senses. I never had any reason to believe that he was out of his senses. As to the question of the arsenic I mean the question of tracing that poison to the possession of Mrs. Eustace Macallan I am able to give evidence which may, perhaps, be worthy of the attention of the Court. I was present in the Fiscal's office during the examination of the papers and of the other objects discovered at Gleninch. The dressing case belonging to the deceased lady was shown to me after its contents had been officially investigated by the Fiscal himself. I happen to have a very sensitive sense of touch. In handling the lid of the dressing case, on the inner side, I felt something at a certain place which induced me to examine the whole structure of the lid very carefully. The result was the discovery of a private repository concealed in the space between the outer wood and the lining. In that repository I found the bottle which I now produce." The further examination of the witness was suspended while the hidden bottle was compared with the bottles properly belonging to the dressing case. These last were of the finest cut glass, and of a very elegant form, entirely unlike the bottle found in the private repository, which was of the commonest manufacture, and of the shape ordinarily in use among chemists. Not a drop of liquid, not the smallest atom of any solid substance remained in it. No smell exhaled from it, and, more unfortunately still for the interest of the defense, no label was found attached to the bottle when it had been discovered. The chemist who had sold the second supply of arsenic to the prisoner was called and examined. He declared that the bottle was exactly like the bottle in which he had placed the arsenic. It was, however, equally like hundreds of other bottles in his shop. In the absence of the label, on which he had himself written the word "poison," it was impossible for him to identify the bottle. The dressing case and the deceased lady's bedroom had been vainly searched for the chemist's missing label, on the chance that it might have become accidentally detached from the mysterious empty bottle. In both instances the search had been without result. Morally, it was a fair conclusion that this might be really the bottle which had contained the poison. Legally, there was not the slightest proof of it. Thus ended the last effort of the defense to trace the arsenic purchased by the prisoner to the possession of his wife. The book relating the practices of the Styrian peasantry, found in the deceased lady's room, had been produced. But could the book prove that she had asked her husband to buy arsenic for her? The crumpled paper, with the grains of powder left in it, had been identified by the chemist, and had been declared to contain grains of arsenic. But where was the proof that Mrs. Eustace Macallan's hand had placed the packet in the cabinet, and had emptied it of its contents? No direct evidence anywhere nothing but conjecture. The renewed examination of Miserrimus Dexter touched on matters of no general interest. The cross examination resolved itself in substance into a mental trial of strength between the witness and the Lord Advocate, the struggle terminating, according to the general opinion, in favor of the witness. One question and one answer only I will repeat here. They appeared to me to be of serious importance to the object that I had in view in regarding the trial. "I believe, Mr. Dexter," the Lord Advocate remarked, in his most ironical manner, "that you have a theory of your own, which makes the death of Mrs. Eustace Macallan no mystery to you." "I may have my own ideas on that subject, as on other subjects," the witness replied. "But let me ask their lordships the judges, am I here to declare theories, or to state facts?" I made a note of that answer. Mr. Dexter's "ideas" were the ideas of a true friend to my husband, and of a man of far more than average ability. They might be of inestimable value to me in the coming time, if I could prevail on him to communicate them. I may mention, while I am writing on the subject, that I added to this first note a second, containing an observation of my own. In alluding to Mrs. Beauly, while he was giving his evidence, Mr. Dexter had spoken of her so slightingly, so rudely, I might almost say, as to suggest he had some strong private reason for disliking, perhaps for distrusting, this lady. Here again it might be of vital importance to me to see Mr. Dexter, and to clear up, if I could, what the dignity of the Court had passed over without notice. The last witness had been now examined. The chair on wheels glided away with the half man in it, and was lost in a distant corner of the Court. The Lord Advocate rose to address the jury for the prosecution. I do not scruple to say that I never read anything so infamous as this great lawyer's speech. He was not ashamed to declare, at starting, that he firmly believed the prisoner to be guilty. What right had he to say anything of the sort? Was it for him to decide? Was he the judge and jury both, I should like to know? Having begun by condemning the prisoner on his own authority, the Lord Advocate proceeded to pervert the most innocent actions of that unhappy man so as to give them as vile an aspect as possible. Thus, when Eustace kissed his poor wife's forehead on her deathbed, he did it to create a favourable impression in the minds of the doctor and the nurse. Again, when his grief under his bereavement completely overwhelmed him, he was triumphing in secret and acting the part. If you looked into his heart, you would see there a diabolical hatred for his wife, and an infatuated passion for Mrs. Beauly. In everything he said, he had lied. In everything he had done, he had acted like a crafty and heartless wretch. So the chief counsel for the prosecution spoke of the prisoner, standing helpless before him at the bar. In my husband's place, if I could have done nothing more, I would have thrown something at his head. As it was, I tore the pages which contained the speech from the prosecution out of the report, and trampled them under my feet and felt all the better, too, for having done it. At the same time, I feel a little ashamed of having revenged myself on the harmless printed leaves now. The 5th day of the trial opened with a speech for the defense. Ah, what a contrast to the infamies uttered by the Lord Advocate was the grand burst of eloquence by the Dean of Faculty, speaking on my husband's side! This illustrious lawyer struck the right note at starting. "I yield to no one," he began, "in the pity I feel for the wife. But I say, the martyr in this case, from first to last, is the husband. Whatever the poor woman may have endured, that unhappy man at the bar has suffered, and is now suffering, more. If he had not been the kindest of men, the most docile and most devoted of husbands, he would never have occupied his present dreadful situation. A man of a meaner and harder nature would have felt suspicions of his wife's motives when she asked him to buy poison, would have seen through the wretchedly commonplace excuses she made for wanting it, and would have wisely and cruelly said, 'No!' The prisoner is not that sort of man. He is too good to his wife, too innocent of any evil thought toward her, or toward any one, to foresee the inconveniences and the dangers to which his fatal compliance may expose him. And what is the result? He stands there, branded as a murderer, because he was too high minded and too honourable to suspect his wife." Speaking thus of the husband, the Dean was just as eloquent and just as unanswerable when he came to speak of the wife. "The Lord Advocate," he said, "has asked, with the bitter irony for which he is celebrated at the Scottish Bar, why we have failed entirely to prove that the prisoner placed the 2 packets of poison in the possession of his wife. I say in answer, we have proved, first, that the wife was passionately attached to the husband; secondly, that she felt bitterly the defects in her personal appearance, and especially the defects in her complexion; and thirdly, that she was informed of arsenic as a supposed remedy for those defects, taken internally. To men who know anything of human nature, there is proof enough. Does my learned friend actually suppose that women are in the habit of mentioning the secret artifices and applications by which they improve their personal appearance? Is it in his experience of the sex that a woman who is eagerly bent on making herself attractive to a man would tell that man, or tell anybody else who might communicate with him, that the charm by which she hoped to win his heart say the charm of a pretty complexion had been artificially acquired by the perilous use of a deadly poison? The bare idea of such a thing is absurd. Of course, nobody ever heard Mrs. Eustace Macallan speak of arsenic. Of course, nobody ever surprised her in the act of taking arsenic. It is in the evidence that she would not even confide her intention to try the poison to the friends who had told her of it as a remedy, and who had got her the book. She actually begged them to consider their brief conversation on the subject as strictly private. From first to last, poor creature, she kept her secret just as she would have kept her secret if she had worn false hair, or if she had been indebted to the dentist for her teeth. And there you see her husband in peril of his life, because a woman acted like a woman, as your wives, gentlemen of the jury, would, in a similar position, act toward you." After such glorious oratory as this I wish I had room to quote more of it the next and last speech delivered at the Trial, that is to say, the charge of the Judge to the jury, is dreary reading indeed. His lordship first told the jury that they could not expect to have direct evidence of the poisoning. Such evidence hardly ever occurred in cases of poisoning. They must be satisfied with the best circumstantial evidence. All quite true, I dare say. But having told the jury they might accept circumstantial evidence, he turned back again on his own words, and warned them against being too ready to trust it. "You must have evidence satisfactory and convincing to your own minds," he said, "in which you find no conjectures, but only irresistible and just inferences." Who is to decide what is a just inference? And what is circumstantial evidence but conjecture? After this specimen, I need give no further extracts from the summing up. The jury, thoroughly bewildered no doubt, took refuge in a compromise. They occupied an hour in considering and debating among themselves in their own room. A jury of women would not have taken a minute. Then they returned into court, and gave their timid and trimming Scotch verdict in these words: "Not proven." Some slight applause followed among the audience, which was instantly checked. The prisoner was dismissed from the bar.
He slowly retired, like a man in deep grief, his head sunk on his breast, not looking at any one, and not replying when his friend spoke to him. He knew, poor fellow, the slur that the verdict left on him. We don't say you are innocent of the crime charged against you; we only say there is not evidence enough to convict you. In that lame and impotent conclusion the proceedings ended at the time, and there they would have remained for all time, but for me. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 21. I see my way. In the grey light of the new morning I closed the report of my husband's trial for the murder of his first wife. No sense of fatigue overpowered me. I had no wish, after my long hours of reading and thinking, to lay down and sleep. It was strange, but it was so. I felt as if I had slept, and had now just awakened, a new woman with a new mind. I could now at last understand Eustace's desertion of me. To a man of his refinement it would have been a martyrdom to meet his wife after she had read the things published of him to all the world in the report. I felt that as he would have felt it. At the same time, I thought he might have trusted me to make amends to him for the martyrdom, and might have come back. Perhaps it might yet end in his coming back. In the meanwhile, and in that expectation, I pitied and forgave him with my whole heart. One little matter only dwelt on my mind disagreeably, in spite of my philosophy. Did Eustace still secretly love Mrs. Beauly, or had I extinguished that passion in him? To what order of beauty did this lady belong? Were we, by any chance, the least in the world like one another? The window of my room looked to the east. I drew up the blind, and saw the sun rising grandly in the clear sky. The temptation to go out and breathe the fresh morning air was irresistible. I put on my hat and shawl, and took the report of the trial under my arm. The bolts of the back door were easily drawn. In another minute I was out in Benjamin's pretty little garden. Composed and strengthened by the inviting solitude and the delicious air, I found courage enough to face the serious question that now confronted me, the question of the future. I had read the trial. I had vowed to devote my life to the sacred object of vindicating my husband's innocence. A solitary, defenseless woman, I stood pledged to myself to carry that desperate resolution through to an end. How was I to begin? The bold way of beginning was surely the wise way in such a position as mine. I had good reasons, founded, as I have already mentioned, on the important part played by this witness at the trial, for believing that the fittest person to advise and assist me was Miserrimus Dexter. He might disappoint the expectations that I had fixed on him, or he might refuse to help me, or, like my uncle Starkweather, he might think I had taken leave of my senses. All these events were possible. Nevertheless, I held to my resolution to try the experiment. If he were in the land of the living, I decided that my first step at starting should take me to the deformed man with the strange name. Supposing he received me, sympathized with me, understood me, what would he say? The nurse, in her evidence, had reported him as speaking in an off-hand manner. He would say, in all probability, "What do you mean to do? And how can I help you to do it?" Had I answers ready, if those two plain questions were put to me? Yes, if I dared own to any human creature what was at that very moment secretly fermenting in my mind. Yes, if I could confide to a stranger a suspicion roused in me by the trial, which I have been thus far afraid to mention even in these pages. It must, nevertheless, be mentioned now. My suspicion led to results which are part of my story and part of my life. Let me own, then, to begin with, that I closed the record of the trial actually agreeing in one important particular with the opinion of my enemy and my husband's enemy, the Lord Advocate. He had characterized the explanation of Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death offered by the defense as a "clumsy subterfuge, in which no reasonable being could discern the smallest fragment of probability." Without going quite so far as this, I too could see no reason whatever in the evidence for assuming that the poor woman had taken an overdose of the poison by mistake. I believed that she had the arsenic secretly in her possession, and that she had tried, or intended to try, the use of it internally, for the purpose of improving her complexion. But further than this I could not advance. The more I thought of it, the more plainly justified the lawyers for the prosecution seemed to me to be in declaring that Mrs. Eustace Macallan had died by the hand of a poisoner, although they were entirely and certainly mistaken in charging my husband with the crime. My husband being innocent, somebody else on my own showing must be guilty. Who among the persons inhabiting the house at the time had poisoned Mrs. Eustace Macallan? My suspicion in answering that question pointed straight to a woman, and the name of that woman was Mrs. Beauly. Yes, to that startling conclusion I had arrived. It was, to my mind, the inevitable result of reading the evidence. Look back for a moment to the letter produced in court, signed Helena, and addressed to Mr. Macallan. No reasonable person can doubt, though the judges excused her from answering the question, that Mrs. Beauly was the writer. Very well. The letter offers, as I think, trustworthy evidence to show the state of the woman's mind when she paid her visit to Gleninch. Writing to Mr. Macallan at a time when she was married to another man, a man to whom she had engaged herself before she met with Mr. Macallan, what does she say? She says, "When I think of your life sacrificed to that wretched woman, my heart bleeds for you." And again she says, "If it had been my unutterable happiness to love and cherish the best, the dearest of men, what a paradise of our own we might have lived in, what delicious hours we might have known." If this is not the language of a woman shamelessly and furiously in love with a man, not her husband, what is? She is so full of him that even her idea of another world (see the letter) is the idea of embracing Mr. Macallan's soul. In this condition of mind and morals, the lady one day finds herself and her embraces free, through the death of her husband. As soon as she can decently visit, she goes visiting, and in due course of time she becomes the guest of the man whom she adores. His wife is ill in bed. The one other visitor at Gleninch is a cripple who can only move in his chair on wheels. The lady has the house and the one beloved object in it all to herself. No obstacle stands between her and the unutterable happiness of loving and cherishing the best, the dearest of men, but a poor, sick, ugly wife, for whom Mr. Macallan never has felt, and never can feel, the smallest particle of love. Is it perfectly absurd to believe that such a woman as this, impelled by these motives, and surrounded by these circumstances, would be capable of committing a crime, if the safe opportunity offered itself? What does her own evidence say? She admits that she had a conversation with Mrs. Eustace Macallan, in which that lady questioned her on the subject of cosmetic applications to the complexion. Did nothing else take place at that interview? Did Mrs. Beauly make no discoveries, afterwards turned to fatal account, of the dangerous experiment which her hostess was then trying to improve her ugly complexion? All we know is that Mrs. Beauly said nothing about it. What does the under gardener say? He heard a conversation between Mr. Macallan and Mrs. Beauly, which shows that the possibility of Mrs. Beauly becoming Mrs. Eustace Macallan had certainly presented itself to that lady's mind, and was certainly considered by her to be too dangerous a topic of discourse to be pursued. Innocent Mr. Macallan would have gone on talking. Mrs. Beauly is discreet and stops him. And what does the nurse, Christina Ormsay, tell us? On the day of Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death, the nurse is dismissed from attendance and is sent downstairs. She leaves the sick woman, recovered from her first attack of illness, and able to amuse herself with writing. The nurse remains away for half an hour, and then gets uneasy at not hearing the invalid's bell. She goes to the morning room to consult Mr. Macallan, and there she hears that Mrs. Beauly is missing. Mr. Macallan doesn't know where she is, and asks Mr. Dexter if he has seen her. Mr. Dexter had not set eyes on her. At what time does the disappearance of Mrs. Beauly take place? At the very time when Christina Ormsay had left Mrs. Eustace Macallan alone in her room. Meanwhile the bell rings at last rings violently. The nurse goes back to the sick room at 5 minutes to 11 or thereabouts, and finds that the bad symptoms of the morning have returned in a gravely aggravated form. A second dose of poison, larger than the dose administered in the early morning, has been given during the absence of the nurse, and, observe, during the disappearance also of Mrs. Beauly.
The nurse, looking out into the corridor for help, encounters Mrs. Beauly herself, innocently on her way from her own room, just up, we are to suppose at 11 in the morning, to inquire after the sick woman. A little later, Mrs. Beauly accompanies Mr. Macallan to visit the invalid. The dying woman casts a strange look at both of them, and tells them to leave her. Mr. Macallan understands this as the fretful outbreak of a person in pain, and waits in the room to tell the nurse that the doctor is sent for. What does Mrs. Beauly do? She runs out panic-stricken the instant Mrs. Eustace Macallan looks at her. Even Mrs. Beauly, it seems, has a conscience. Is there nothing to justify suspicion in such circumstances as these? Circumstances sworn to on the oaths of the witnesses? To me the conclusion is plain. Mrs. Beauly's hand gave that second dose of poison. Admit this, and the inference follows that she also gave the first dose in the early morning. How could she do it? Look again at the evidence. The nurse admits that she was asleep from past 2 in the morning to 6. She also speaks of a locked door of communication with the sick room, the key of which had been removed, nobody knew by whom. Some person must have stolen that key. Why not Mrs. Beauly? One word more, and all that I had in my mind at that time will be honestly revealed. Miserrimus Dexter, under cross-examination, had indirectly admitted that he had ideas of his own on the subject of Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death. At the same time, he had spoken of Mrs. Beauly in a tone which plainly betrayed that he was no friend to that lady. Did he suspect her too? My chief motive in deciding to ask his advice before I applied to any one else was to find an opportunity of putting that question to him. If he really thought of her as I did, my course was clear before me. The next step to take would be carefully to conceal my identity, and then to present myself in the character of a harmless stranger to Mrs. Beauly. There were difficulties, of course, in my way. The first and greatest difficulty was to obtain an introduction to Miserrimus Dexter. The composing influence of the fresh air in the garden had by this time made me readier to lie down and rest than to occupy my mind in reflecting on my difficulties. Little by little I grew too drowsy to think, then too lazy to go on walking. My bed looked wonderfully inviting as I passed by the open window of my room. In 5 minutes more I had accepted the invitation of the bed, and had said farewell to my anxieties and my troubles. In 5 minutes more I was fast asleep. A discreetly gentle knock at my door was the first sound that aroused me. I heard the voice of my good old Benjamin speaking outside. "My dear, I am afraid you will be starved if I let you sleep any longer. It is 1:30, and a friend of yours has come to lunch with us." A friend of mine? What friends had I? My husband was far away, and my uncle Starkweather had given me up in despair. "Who is it?" I cried out from my bed through the door. "Major Fitz David," Benjamin answered, by the same medium. I sprang out of bed. The very man I wanted was waiting to see me. Major Fitz David, as the phrase is, knew everybody. Intimate with my husband, he would certainly know my husband's old friend, Miserrimus Dexter. Shall I confess that I took particular pains with my toilet, and that I kept the luncheon waiting? The woman doesn't live who would have done otherwise, when she had a particular favor to ask of Major Fitz David. Chapter 21.